After studying this module, you shall be able to know the general meaning of cultural transmission, understand the process involved in cultural transmission, learn the barriers of cultural transmission, know the concept of intergenerational relations, identify the relation between cultural transmission. This module endeavors to link two constructs, cultural transmission and intergenerational relations. While discussing the theoretical frameworks of transmission of culture in our last module, we realized the significance of cultural transmission. During the course, the eco-cultural framework had been analyzed as the most significant framework discussion, the direction and forms of cultural transmission. In this module, we will take an overview of cultural transmission. Thereafter, we will focus on the meaning of intergenerational relations. After discussing the meaning and the nature and the process of relationship, we will examine as to how culture is transmitted through the generations. What are the conditions that favors transmission? How then these transmission influence the relationships of generations and facilitate the survival and preservation of culture. With these few queries in mind, we preempt our deliberation on cultural transmission and intergenerational relations. Cultural transmission. Human beings have the unique capacity to acquire things from their environment. They have developed signs and symbols in their verbal and non-verbal language. These signs and symbols form the complex system of communication that is transmitted from one generation to another generation. The customs, laws, rules, norms, ethics and conventions of one culture is consciously or unconsciously passed from one generation to another. This process of transmission of culture is a key element in cultural transmission. The whole notion of cultural transmission is about the mediums through which aspects that form integral part of the culture, customs, laws, conventions, eating, dressing, child rearing practices, etc. are conveyed from one community to another. Cavalli, Forza, Feldman, Chen and Dornbusch defined cultural transmission as the process of acquisition of behaviors, attitudes or technologies through imprinting, conditioning, imitation, active teaching and learning or combination of these. Keesing wrote that culture is a system of social transmitted behavior patterns that serve to relate human communities to their ecological settings. Thus, cultural transmission can be constructed as social progress regulating preservation of communities and societies from past many centuries. Nature of cultural transmission. Cultural transmission is selective. One of the features that characterizes nature of transmission is its selective in nature. Not each information, custom, values, ideology is passed on from one generation to other. Construe culture as the totality of equivalent and complementary learned meaning maintained by a human population or identifiable segment of population and transmitted from generation to the next. Rohner emphasizes that transmission from generation to another helps regulating intergenerational stability in a population's symbolic meaning systems. However, there are few meaning systems that are created and disappear in the span of single generations. There are few that stay indefinitely in the culture. This approximation of time and sharing across cultures play pivotal role in bringing universality of an aspect within cultures. This also indicates that culture is selective. Since few norms prevail over time across societies, generation and few subside with time, this is an important aspect that forms subject matter of cross-cultural psychology. Whether a behavior, technology, customs, etc., systems or symbols maintains over period or not, shared across culture or are specific to one culture. Thus, time plays a pivotal role in bringing strength to the system of symbols. Cultural transmission is bidirectional process. Researchers observed that cultural transmission is bidirectional process in which parents transfer information to their offsprings and offsprings also communicate current values, orientations and customs to their parents. Baumrind took into account that intentions and learning process of parents in transmission process. Indeed, few early research had accounted child to be an active learner. They valued intentions and learning process of children in inspiring authority and parents to formulate and construct new values and ideologies. This drive gives impetus to social change and continuity in society. Domains of cultural transmission. Boyer proposed the theory of exhaustive cultural transmission. He argued that cultural transmission is a part of cognitive domain in which receiver conceptualize the information passively. In contrast, Garrett emphasized transmission to be part of language domains, as one explicitly communicates the information and received from the culture. However, two domains of knowledge had always been in debate so far. Thus, one can take a balance point of view whereby we can take both stand of cultural transmission being both linguistic and cognitive in nature. Now, coming to sources of cultural transmission. Tromsdorf contended that there are two causes of cultural transmission, biological and interpersonal. One of the theories supporting biological basis of cultural transmission includes attachment is condition whereby the child develops attention towards his primary caretakers. The extent to which children develops the affection for caretaker will facilitate the acquisition of information from the caretakers. This secure attachment prepares offsprings to transmit similar level of attachment to their offsprings. Other biological abilities that is acquired through social learning are empathy, joint attention, theory of mind and imitation. The second source of cultural transmission is interpersonal relations. Indeed, no one can doubt the interpersonal source of cultural transmission. But most important question that impinges in this context, what is important to measure the outcome or to understand the process of interpersonal relation? Tromsdorf highlighted that there are two limitations if researchers studies outcome rather than process while examining interpersonal source of cultural transmission. Firstly, it is difficult to measure the true outcome of the relationships, dyads, triad, since other variable factor may confront the study like motivational level, interest of the participants, etc. Second, in search for outcome, the researcher is unable to capture the process and direction, unidirectional and bidirectional, of the relationships. However, the process of cultural transmission can elaborate the length and breadth of our knowledge. Eco-cultural model of integrational relations as the basis for cultural transmission. The concept of integration relations. The term intergenerational relations refers to the kind and quality of association between two or more generations. Brubaker and Brubaker suggested 4 attributes that characterizes intergenerational relations, which are respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and resilience across generations. These attributes are the bedrock of the bond that develops across generations. Researchers argued that intergenerational relations are the indicator of amount of social change occurring in the society. Historically, intergenerational relations trace itself from the concept of intergeneration transmission in cultural context from the lifespan perspective. The whole idea emerges from the fact that there is selective transfer of values, skills, ideologies that happen between cohorts sharing similar historical and political context. The fact that few values sustain themselves for so many centuries indicates that the generations have been transmitting the particular norm, values and belief from so many years, from one generation. Earlier, intergenerational transmission thought to move in vertical unidirectional or oblique directional manner. However, recently the relationship had been found out to be bidirectional and indirect in nature. Theoretical framework relating cultural transmission and intergenerational relations. Tromsdorf in 2009 contended that cultural transmission refers to the way values, knowledge and practices that are prevalent in one generation are transmitted to the next generation. According to Tromsdorf, one needs to develop a theoretical framework to understand the outcomes of cultural transmission. In our previous module on theoretical framework of transmission of culture, Tromsdorf had proposed the eco-cultural model of intergenerational relations. That is the foundation of cultural transmission. This model is a holistic model that includes 4 parameters: the variables of cultural transmission that contribute to the process, the mechanism of cultural transmission, the factors that facilitate the transmission process, and finally, the outcome of cultural transmission on intergenerational relations. Thus, we initiate our discussion by introducing the variables involved in the process of intergenerational cultural transmission. Variables. Tromsdorf identified that there are 4 variables that determine the process of cultural transmission. First, the agents who transmit the information. Second, relationship between agents involved in the process. Third, the context to be transmitted. And fourth, the cultural context in which transmission occurs. The effect of these variables on cultural transmission may be direct or indirect on intergenerational relations. Agents or carriers of information. As seen earlier also, in all the theoretical frameworks, we observed various structures that carry information of culture. Few carriers are parents, offsprings, peers, siblings, neighbors, schools in an immediate microsystem. The psychological process evolved by these agents forms the part of mesosystem. Finally, media, community practices and the politico-historic economic movement are agents of macrosystem. These agents influence the process and the outcome of the cultural transmission. These preferences, desires and attitude directly impacts the length and breadth of information gained by the receiver. Features of the agents that contribute to the transmission process are maturity of the agent, experience of carrier while gaining information about culture, social status of the agent, level of acceptance of the receiver, the intention and route via which information is transmitted. Relationship between the agents. As inferred from the previous variable, even the relationship between the agents, such as parents and offsprings, uncle and child, peer groups amongst each other, will affect the selectivity and maintenance of the information. For instance, the information given by peer groups of same age may maintain for a long time and opted strongly that given by people from other communities. Thus, these relationships between agents can be characterized by elements like level of agreement, disagreement between two agents, intimacy and familiarities between agents and receivers, obligation and responsibility perceived by the receiver and agents respectively. Schonflug argued that the person-oriented approach, captivating description about the qualities of relationships, can be referred to as transmission belt. Thus, there may be different levels of transmission belts in which the relationships between individual and other variable relates. The cultural context. Two forms of cultural context observed in society are homogeneous versus heterogeneity and continuing and stable societies. These contexts affect the beliefs, competence of the person. For instance, homogeneous societies can be those where congruent information are diffused through oblique transmission, vertical transmission and horizontal transmission. While in heterogeneous society, there may be variations in the cultural meaning existing between vertical, horizontal and oblique direction of transmission. Even wider socio-economic, historical, political and cultural context may restrain or facilitate the transmission of culture. If similar socio-economic, historical, political is continued, then there are no antithesis of thoughts and the transmission of information will also be stabilized and coincide with the previous generation. However, crisis in cultural, historical, political and economic context will bring transformation in knowledge transmitted to the individuals in the generations. Content. The content of the information plays an important role. The level of significance that the content holds for the receiver and the agent will influence of the transmission of the content from one generation to its descendants. Other characteristics of content includes consistency of content, how far it has collective essence and the extent to which it has incorporated in the society across generations. All these variables mitigate the process of cultural transmission and influence the relations across various generations. Since we have understood these variables, now we will examine how does cultural transmission takes place in intergeneration and what factors of generations will facilitate the cultural transmission and analyze the outcome of the transmission on intergenerational relations. Mechanism of cultural transmission. Schonflug reported two factors contributing to cultural transmission, which include A. The awareness of the information to be transmitted, B. The acceptance of it. In case no choices is given to the individual, then the transmission process will largely depend on the readiness of the transmitter to transmit and receive to take the information. Finally, mechanisms include routes such as horizontal, vertical and oblique transmission and forms of transmission which include socialization, enculturation and acculturation, discussed in the previous module in detail. Now, attributes of intergenerational relations that facilitate the transmission process. Brubaker and Brubaker argued that four attributes that qualifies strength of intergenerational relations. As I understand, these are the conditions that can also facilitate the transmission process across the generation in the transmission belt. These conditions are respect. The extent to which people in generations admire and instill value in the other group of individual in generation will determine the transmission of values, customs, rituals, life scripts of the other generation. Often it is bidirectional in nature. Studies indicate that the development stage contribute to the respect given to the other generation. Empirical studies show that generally adults exhibit respect for other generations more than adolescent generations to the adults. Since older generation had passed through various crises and challenges of career, marriage, parenting, etc., the achievements and failure, their experience provide lessons to the adult who are passing or yet to through these challenges and crises. Contrary, adolescent and younger adults are less aware of the achievements of the older adults and may not hold reverence towards the elders. Thus, it is easier to transmit information to those generations that exhibit regard towards the other group of generation. Another interesting observation that have enough empirical evidence is about the directionality of respect. Earlier studies had emphasized transmission is unidirectional, vertical or oblique directions. However, recently the transmission of information observed to be bidirectional. Thus, the respect that each generation holds for other may facilitate the process of cultural transmission more smoothly. Responsibility. Another attribute that qualifies relationship is responsibility. This can also be explained in terms of dependability, obligation towards others. Responsibility towards the generation is bidirectional in nature. That is, the function of developmental stage in which generation prevails. Generally, elders feel accountable to bring up the younger generation. Children, adolescent and even younger adults in few cultures. However, after a certain development in lifespan, the younger generation also exhibits responsibility towards the aged parents. This is known as filial responsibility. This form of relationship facilitates transmission at two levels. When elders transfer their values to the younger generation, and B, when younger share their values to the elder that is demanded in that period of history. The effect of the response at each level may lead to conflict or harmony. Thus, the level of conflict and harmony will determine whether the culture continues to same value or observe the process of change at either side. Reciprocity. We can't clap from one hand, can't click without a finger. Similarly, relationship between two generations is not one-way street. As we have emphasized the bidirectionality between two persons in generation from the beginning, the reciprocal relationship will facilitate transmission within the two generations. If one generation tries to dominate or expects obligation without returning the same, in such context, the transmission of culture is not smooth. There will be a discord between the generation that can lead to social change and extinct few values that are described earlier in the generation of historical context. Resilience. Resilience refers to hardiness, toughness of the generation. It explains how well a generation is able to manage the change, crisis and challenges within the system. There had been an important political, economic, social decision taken by generations in the history. The attitude with which the decisions are adhered and followed will impact the descendants. Outcome of the cultural transmission on intergenerational relations. Tromsdorf discovered that the process of cultural transmission on intergenerational relations can produce two forms of effect. The first is described in terms of the extent to which the value, norms, ideas, symbols of the culture continues or not. Secondly, outcome is observed in form of level to which generation selects the information given in society. Finally, we can conclude by saying that nature, processes and mechanism of cultural transmission will create values that define intergenerational relations. At the same time, the relations across generations facilitate cultural transmission within the society. Now, coming to the summary, while discussing the theoretical framework of transmission of culture, we realized the significance of cultural transmission. During the course, the eco-cultural framework had been analyzed as the most significant framework discussion on the direction and forms of cultural transmission. Human beings have the unique capacity to acquire things from their environment. They have developed signs and symbols in their verbal and non-verbal language. These signs and symbols form the complex systems of communication that is transmitted from one generation to another generation. According to Tromsdorff, one needs to develop a theoretical framework to understand the outcome of cultural transmission. Also, cultural transmission can be constructed as a social process of regulating preservation of communities and societies from past many centuries. The process of transmission of culture is a selective process and is bi-directional in nature. The whole idea of intergenerational research emerges from the fact that there is selective transfer of values, skills, ideologies that happens between cohorts sharing similar historical and political context. And it would not be wrong to say that basic nature of cultural transmission is to create values that define intergenerational relations within the society.